My father told the courtroom I'd die broke. Then the judge stood up and called me a hero. My father said it without lowering his voice. He wanted everyone to hear it. I made absolutely certain you walk out of here with nothing. Enjoy whatever comes next. A few people in the courtroom flinched. Others exchanged awkward glances. One man near the back actually smiled. The words floated through the air like something toxic, heavy, deliberate, impossible to pretend away. I stared across the room at him. Gerald Harmon, 67 years old, owner of one of the most successful commercial development firms in the state, a man whose name appeared on hospital donor plaques, a man whose photograph hung in the local chamber of commerce, a man who had spent the better part of my life treating me like I was a regret he couldn't quite shake. And in that moment, he looked satisfied, not heated, not emotional, satisfied, the way someone looks when they've finally delivered a punishment they've been planning for years. I stared at him for a long moment. Then I laughed. Not a performance, not a reflex, a real laugh, the kind that rises from somewhere honest before your brain can intercept it. My father's expression collapsed. What exactly is funny to you? Before I could say a word, the judge lifted his head from the documents in front of him. His eyes moved slowly across the room and settled on my face. He looked puzzled at first, then something shifted, something closer to recognition. "Hold on," he said quietly. The entire courtroom went still. He leaned forward. "You're the woman who—" And just like that, every pair of eyes in that room turned toward me. But to understand what happened next, I have to take you back. Because that courtroom moment didn't begin that morning. It began more than 20 years earlier, in a house where I was learning, slowly, painfully, that not all children are loved the same way. My name is Diane Harmon. I'm 34 years old. And for most of my life, I carried the quiet, corrosive belief that something about me simply wasn't enough. I grew up in a mid-sized city in the Midwest. My father built commercial properties. My mother managed the household. My older brother, Nathan, had 6 years on me. From the outside, we looked exactly like a success story. Inside, things had a different texture entirely. Nathan was the son our father orbited. I was somewhere in the background, vaguely acknowledged. I noticed it before I was 10. If Nathan passed a difficult exam, Dad took the whole family to dinner. If I earned the highest grade in my class, Dad nodded once and moved on. If Nathan scored in a championship game, Dad bought him something new. If I won an academic scholarship, he usually forgot which night the ceremony was. I did what children do. I tried harder. I cleaned without being asked. I stayed out of trouble. I made honor roll every semester for 6 consecutive years. Nothing shifted. One night, around age 13, I finally said it aloud to my mother. "He doesn't actually like me very much, does he?" She looked like I'd knocked the air out of her. She sat very still for a moment. Then she smiled softly and said, "Of course he loves you, sweetheart." I remember looking down at my plate. That's not what I asked. She never answered. That silence became one of the defining sounds of my childhood. Nathan grew into a younger version of our father, confident, entitled, and absolutely certain the world owed him its best seat. Dad gave him a summer position in the company at 17, a company vehicle at 19, a management title the week after his college graduation. No competition, no interview, just handed over like a birthright. I worked my way through nursing school on scholarships and 2 part-time jobs. My father didn't attend the pinning ceremony. Then came September 2001. Like millions of people, I watched everything change on a Tuesday morning. Something moved inside me, a current I couldn't ignore. I wanted my existence to mean something beyond a paycheck and a family dinner where no one asked about my week. A year later, I enlisted in the Army. The conversation with my father is carved into my memory in permanent detail. We were at the kitchen table. I was 20, nervous but certain. "Dad, I enlisted." He stared at me, just stared. "The Army." "Yes, I want to serve." His face went through several stages before arriving at contempt. "You want to throw away everything you have." I see it differently. Of course you do. What followed was the longest, most circular argument of our shared history. He said I was making a catastrophic mistake. I told him the decision was made. He accused me of abandoning the family. I pointed out that Nathan had already claimed everything worth claiming. He stood up before we'd resolved anything. You'll regret this. I carried those words with me for over a decade, mostly because they ever came true. Military life was many things. Easy wasn't one of them. There were deployments that aged me faster than calendars should allow. There were nights that never fully left me. There were friends whose names I now say only at memorials. But for the first time in my life, I belonged somewhere that didn't ask whose daughter I was. Nobody cared about my father's company or my brother's title. The military cared about performance, character, reliability, and courage, things I could build with my own hands. I became a combat medic, then a commissioned officer. I built something real, a career, a purpose, a community of people who trusted me with their lives. My relationship with my father, meanwhile, dissolved into something almost ceremonial. Holiday visits, brief phone calls, conversations that never broke the surface. Every gathering had the same choreography. He'd ask when I was planning to leave the service. Nathan would talk about the company's latest project. My mother would keep everything polite, and we'd all go home. No one ever asked what I had seen overseas. No one ever asked who I had become. That's how they missed the most important thing that ever happened to me. 5 years before the courtroom, I was a captain assigned to a unit operating in a high-risk province of Afghanistan. It was my third deployment. I knew the terrain, the rhythms, the particular way danger announced itself in that part of the world. It was a July afternoon, the kind of heat that presses against your skin like a physical thing. We had just returned from a patrol when the alarm systems erupted across the compound. Then the explosion hit. The blast rolled through the ground like something geological. Windows burst. A column of smoke rose from one of the operations buildings. People were shouting before the sound had even finished echoing. Training took over completely. I didn't think, I moved. When everyone runs from the fire, medics run toward it. The building was already partially collapsed. Flames had claimed one wing and were working methodically toward the rest. We had soldiers unaccounted for. Nobody had a clean count of who was still inside. A sergeant grabbed my arm at the entrance. "Captain, the structure isn't safe." I pulled free. There are still people in there. I went in. The visibility inside was almost nothing. Smoke had turned the air into a solid thing. The heat was extraordinary, the kind that makes you understand, on a cellular level, why fire kills. Debris covered the floor. The ceiling groaned with the sound of something preparing to give way. I found the first soldier near a collapsed interior wall. Conscious, disoriented, unable to stand, I got him out. Then I went back in. The third trip was worse than the second. The fourth was worse than the third. On my fourth entry, I found a young lieutenant, 24 years old, pinned beneath a collapsed support beam, his radio already dead. The smoke had reached the kind of density where you breathe it more than air. The ceiling above us made sounds I prefer not to remember. I am not certain how we got out. I know we did. I know he was alive when the fresh air hit us. After that, there are only fragments, weight, heat, voices outside, the sensation of the ground rising toward me. I woke up 40 hours later. Concussion, smoke inhalation, some burns, nothing that would keep me grounded for more than a few weeks. 6 soldiers came out of that building. That was the number that mattered to me, the only number. The Army filed their reports. There was an investigation, a commendation, a ceremony. A medal was placed in my hands. Some photographs were taken. Local media ran a brief story. I moved on. Most service members do. You don't save people for recognition. You save them because they're there and you can. Several months later, a handwritten letter arrived at my unit's administrative office. It had been forwarded twice before reaching me. The man who wrote it was the father of the young lieutenant. He thanked me in language so careful and raw that I had to stop reading twice. He said there were no words sufficient for what he wanted to express. He said his family had spent hours believing their son was dead. He said his wife still cried sometimes, not from grief, but from relief that still hadn't fully resolved itself. I read the letter several times. Then I folded it and put it in a drawer. My family never learned it existed. They never asked about my deployments, so there was never a natural moment to say. I almost died pulling people out of a burning building in Afghanistan, and the father of one of them wrote me a letter I'll probably keep forever. Some silences aren't chosen, they simply accumulate. Back in the courtroom, the hearing had resumed, but the atmosphere had changed without anyone announcing why. The judge kept looking at me, not casually, searchingly, the way you look at someone you're almost certain you know but can't quite place. He'd glance at the documents, then back at my face. At one point he removed his glasses entirely, studied me, then put them back without comment. My father remained completely unaware of this. He sat beside Nathan, with the posture of a man who had already won. Then the judge set down his pen. "Miss Harmon," his voice was measured and deliberate. I straightened. "Yes, Your Honor." "Would you please stand?" I rose slowly. Every person in the room followed the motion. The judge studied my face for a long moment. Then he asked, quietly, "Were you a combat medic stationed near Kandahar approximately 5 years ago?" The question landed in the room, like a stone dropped into still water. "Yes, sir," I said. A murmur moved through the gallery. The judge nodded almost imperceptibly. "And were you the officer who entered a burning structure multiple times, following an enemy attack to recover trapped soldiers?" The hum of the air conditioning was suddenly very loud. "Yes, sir." The judge closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were bright with something that had no business being in a probate hearing. My father leaned toward his attorney. "What does any of this have to do with?" The judge turned toward him, just turned, said nothing. My father went quiet. Then the judge rose from his seat, which judges do not casually do, and looked out at the room with an expression I will never forget as long as I live. "I cannot stand here and pretend I don't know who this woman is." Silence. "My son was serving in Afghanistan 5 years ago." His voice was steady but carrying something enormous beneath it. His unit was hit during what should have been a routine operation. The building he was in caught fire. Several men were trapped. He paused. The room did not breathe. "We received a call telling us there had been casualties. My wife and I spent 4 hours believing our son was one of them." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I can tell you exactly where I was standing when the phone rang. I can tell you exactly what the light looked like in that room. Some moments burn themselves into you permanently." His gaze returned to me. "We later learned that a captain, a combat medic, had entered that building 4 separate times while it was actively collapsing. She pulled 6 soldiers out. My son was the last one." He reached into his briefcase. From a worn leather folder, he removed a document I recognized instantly. "A copy of the letter. I wrote this 8 months after the rescue," he said. "I keep it in my desk. I read it every Veterans Day." He unfolded it with the kind of care you give to something sacred, because some debts cannot be repaid, they can only be acknowledged. He read a few lines aloud. Not many, just enough for the room to understand what a father sounds like when he has nearly lost the thing he loves most and has been handed it back by a stranger. When he finished, the room was absolutely silent. One woman in the gallery was crying, without making any attempt to conceal it. One of the opposing attorneys was staring at the floor. The judge folded the letter carefully and returned it to the folder. Then he turned to my father. His voice was calm, completely calm, which somehow made it worse. "It appears this is new information to her family." My father swallowed. For the first time all morning, he looked uncertain. "I find that extraordinary," the judge said, "given who she is." He sat back down slowly. Then he looked at my father with the kind of measured clarity that only comes from someone who has nothing to prove. "You may not know your daughter, Mr. Harmon." The room held its breath. "But I do." My father had spent 40 years constructing a version of himself that the world would respect. He'd been meticulous about it: the donations, the handshakes, the reputation carefully assembled like a building he'd designed himself. Now, in a room full of people who had just heard what his daughter had done with her life, he looked like a man sitting inside a structure with cracked walls. He did not look angry, he looked small. The judge turned his attention back to the estate documents. Something had shifted in his face, the emotional moment was over, replaced by something sharper, professional, alert. He picked up a folder, reviewed several pages, stopped. "Counselor," he addressed my father's attorney, "I have a question regarding these property transfers." The attorney straightened. "Of course, Your Honor." "The Riverside Holdings. Can you explain the timing of this reallocation?" The attorney accepted the document. His confident expression evaporated before he'd reached the second paragraph. "I'll need a moment to review this." "Take your time." But the judge's tone suggested that patience had limits. My father went very still, the particular stillness of someone who has just realized the room has anged around them. Nathan noticed. "Dad," no response. "Dad." "It's nothing," his voice was flat. But it didn't sound like nothing. It didn't sound like nothing at all. The judge called a recess. The moment the gavel struck, the room broke into urgent, hushed conversation. Attorneys clustered around tables. Spectators leaned toward each other. The atmosphere had completely transformed. What had begun as a routine inheritance dispute now felt like something far more serious. My mother crossed the room and sat beside me. She looked older than I remembered. Smaller, like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. "Rachel," she said softly, "she uses my middle name when she's upset. I didn't know about Afghanistan, about any of it." "I know. Why didn't you ever?" "Mom," I looked at her gently, "when would I have told you?" She opened her mouth, then she closed it, because the answer was obvious and she knew it. There had never been a moment, not one dinner, not one phone call, not one visit where someone had asked, "What is your life actually like? What have you seen? What have you survived?" She took my hand, her fingers were cold. I should have asked. "Yes." She looked down. I should have asked a lot of things. Across the room, Nathan and our father were having an argument conducted entirely in whispered syllables and body language. Nathan looked shaken. Dad looked like a man deciding which version of the truth to commit to. That alone was remarkable. Nathan had never questioned our father, not visibly, not that I had ever witnessed. Something had broken loose. When the recess ended, the judge returned to the bench with the focused energy of someone who had found something important and intended to address it systematically. "Before we proceed," he said, "I need to discuss several transactions connected to this estate." The room went quiet in a different way than before, not awestruck, alarmed. He laid out dates, property transfers, account reallocations, ownership modifications. Most of it was dense legal language that moved slowly through the air. Then he reached a specific date. My mother went pale. The judge noticed. "You recognize this date, Mrs. Harmon." She looked at my father. Then she looked at the judge. Something resolved in her face, a decision made quickly, perhaps one she'd been postponing for years. "Yes," her voice was quiet but steady. "That was the week my father was in the hospital." "Your father being Edmund Lawson?" "Yes." "Medical records indicate he was heavily sedated throughout that period." My father's attorney rose. "Objection." "On what grounds?" The judge waited. "Nothing came." He continued. "During that same window, multiple modifications to the estate documentation were executed." He lifted a document. "I'd like to understand the mechanics of that." Then he opened the thick folder. From inside it, he removed a handwritten document, careful, deliberate handwriting on aged paper. "This," he said, "appears to be an earlier version of Mr. Lawson's estate plan." Nathan's head snapped up. "What does it say?" The judge read select passages, not the whole document, just enough. My grandfather had originally divided his estate equally between Nathan and me. 50-50. Exactly. The room erupted. I sat without moving. My mind ran the number again. 50-50. Equal shares. My grandfather, who had always treated me fairly, who had listened when I spoke, who had asked about my deployments and remembered the details I'd mentioned months earlier, he had never cut me out. Someone had done it for him. Nathan's voice came out strangled. Dad, what is this? Silence. Dad. My father stared at the far wall, like a man trying to find a door that wasn't there. The judge's voice remained even. Mr. Harmon, can you explain the discrepancy between the original estate plan and the final recorded version? Nothing. Can you explain why several transfers were executed while the primary benefactor was incapacitated? My father opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time in memory, William Gerald Harmon had no answer ready. Nathan looked at him, not with admiration, not with loyalty, not with the reflexive deference of a son who had spent his entire life performing for an audience of one. He looked at him with doubt. Raw, shattering doubt. I'm ordering a comprehensive review of these records, the judge said. These proceedings are postponed pending that investigation. My father's voice came out quiet and defensive. This is completely unnecessary. The judge looked at him with the patience of someone who has heard that exact sentence many times in many contexts. What's unnecessary, Mr. Harmon, he said, is that it took this long for anyone to ask the right questions. The review moved quickly once it began. Forensic accountants, document specialists, property attorneys, they moved through my grandfather's records with the thoroughness of people who had been handed something genuinely complicated. I returned to my life at the Veterans Medical Center, where I worked, trying to maintain the rhythm of ordinary days while the investigation unfolded in the background. The calls started within 2 weeks. My mother first, then my attorney, then Nathan. People who had never called to ask about my deployments were calling constantly now. The irony registered, but I tried not to hold it. My attorney was measured about it. They found more than anyone expected. He paused. Multiple transactions executed during your grandfather's hospitalization. Several signatures under review. Ownership changes that don't align with the documented timeline. I sat with that for a long time. Not with anger, with grief. Because every answer made the family smaller somehow. Every confirmation of wrongdoing was also a confirmation of how much had been sacrificed, trust, fairness, my grandfather's actual wishes, for the sake of an inheritance that could have simply been shared. 3 weeks later, Nathan appeared at my door. I almost didn't recognize him. The confidence was gone, not replaced by humility exactly, but by something more complicated. Exhaustion, reckoning. Can we talk? We sat at my kitchen table. He stared at his coffee for a long time. Did you know, he asked finally, that Grandpa wanted things split evenly? No, did you? No, he laughed once without humor. I spent my entire life thinking I earned what I was given. I watched him carefully. I thought Dad trusted me because I was capable, he said. I thought I had actually built something. He looked up. It turns out I was handed everything and told it was merit. Favoritism poisons everyone it touches. The overlooked child suffers the obvious wound. The favored one suffers a subtler one, a life built on a foundation that was never tested, a confidence that rests on sand. Nathan was only now discovering the ground beneath him. I never asked for this, he said quietly. I know. I honestly believed Grandpa changed his mind. He looked at me, his eyes were red. You hate me, don't you? The question surprised me. I considered it honestly. No, I said. I probably would. Maybe when I was younger. We sat in the strange, unfamiliar quiet of two people who had spent their whole lives competing for something neither of them had actually been given. An honest family. Before he left, he stopped at the door. Diane. Yes. I'm sorry, simple, undecorated, real. It landed exactly as he'd intended. My mother asked me to come by a few days later. I drove to the house where I grew up. The maple tree in the front yard was enormous now. Everything looked the same but somehow viewed from further away. She met me at the door. We sat in the living room. I knew some things weren't right, she said. She twisted a tissue in her hands. I didn't know everything, she paused, but I knew enough. I looked at her. I should have said something, her voice cracked. I should have defended you. Yes, I said, you should have. I didn't say it with cruelty. I said it the way you state a fact about the weather. It's simply true, and she knew it. She hugged me before I left, longer than she ever had when I was young. Neither of us said anything more. Sometimes the most important conversations are the ones that simply acknowledge what actually happened, without revision. My father called on a Tuesday night, 6 weeks after the investigation findings became undeniable. I stared at his name on my screen for 3 full rings. Hello. Diane, his voice was different. I couldn't name it immediately, then I could. Diminished. I'd like to see you. Why? A long pause, because I owe you things I should have said years ago. I looked out at the rain against my window. I don't know if that's a good idea. I understand. Another pause, please. One word, quiet, almost tentative. My father had never said please to me in a way that sounded like he meant it. The Veterans Memorial Park downtown sits on a rise above the river. Stone monuments, engraved names, a place people visit when they need to be reminded of what sacrifice looks like made permanent. He was already there when I arrived. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him in person. Not just physically, the architecture of his confidence had changed. The way he held his shoulders was different. The way he stood when he saw me was different. We sat on a bench with several feet of space between us, like careful strangers. The review is finished, he said. I know. They found what they found. He stared toward the memorial wall. Most of it is accurate. I waited. I wasn't angry because you enlisted. His voice was quiet and strange. I turned to look at him. I know that's what you thought, what I said, but it wasn't the truth. Then W. Hat was. He was quiet for a moment, then he said a name. His brother, my uncle, a man who died overseas before I was born, whose name the family almost never spoke. He enlisted at 19, my father said. He was killed 14 months later. The wind moved through the memorial garden. I remember the funeral. I remember my mother after it. I remember my father before it and after it and how they weren't the same man. He rubbed his face. When you told me you'd signed up, all I could see was a casket. I sat very still. I was terrified. He laughed, a worn, exhausted sound. Instead of saying that, I punished you for it. For 20 years, I watched you succeed at exactly the thing I'd spent 2 decades dreading, and I couldn't tell you I was proud because being proud meant accepting you were going to keep going, and every year you kept going was another year I waited for the call that never came. The sun had moved behind clouds. The river was gray and steady below us. I failed you, he said. Every version of it, as a father, as a person, as someone who should have loved you without conditions. His voice broke on the last word. I am sorry. Real tears, not performance, he didn't hide them. Not for the inheritance. Not because things came to light. I am sorry for you, for what you deserved and didn't receive. I looked at the wall of names. People who gave everything for strangers. People who signed their names to a promise and kept it even when keeping it cost them completely. My father had his grief. It was real. It had shaped him in ways that damage people quietly and permanently. An explanation isn't an excuse. Wounds aren't permission. But there's something. I don't expect forgiveness, he said. I looked at him, the man who had hurt me, the man who had failed me, the man who was still, despite all of it, my father. I hadn't forgiven him yet. But for the first time in 20 years, I was genuinely considering it. The estate case concluded 6 weeks later. There were no dramatic scenes. Real legal resolutions rarely look like television. There were documents and revised filings, and a judge who had clearly committed to getting it right. The findings were confirmed. Several estate modifications had been made improperly, some during a period when my grandfather had been too ill to meaningfully consent to anything. The affected assets were restored. The original intentions were honored, as closely as law could reconstruct them. My grandfather had wanted equity. He had always wanted equity. He'd simply trusted the wrong person to carry it forward. I thought about him a lot in those final weeks. The way he'd asked about my deployments when no one else did. The way he'd said, once, without ceremony, "I'm proud of the person you became." I'd stored that sentence in a private place for years without fully understanding why. Now I understood. I don't tell this story for the inheritance, though fairness matters and my grandfather's wishes deserve to be honored. I don't tell it for the courtroom moment, though I'd be lying if I said watching the truth announce itself without my help wasn't something I'll carry with me. I tell it because of something the judge said as the proceedings closed, something addressed not to anyone specific, but to everyone in the room. The people who serve this country come home changed. Most of them will never tell you how. They don't ask for recognition. They don't ask for gratitude. They ask for what every person asks for quietly across their entire lives. He paused. To be seen. I walked out of that courthouse into pale winter sunlight. The river was visible from the steps. The memorial park was visible beyond it. My whole adult life, I had run toward burning buildings, toward breaking things, toward people who needed someone to stay when every instinct said leave. Not because I was fearless, because I'd found something worth running toward. I still have the letter, the one the lieutenant's father wrote me. I still keep it in a drawer. Some things you hold on to not because they prove anything, but because they remind you that the moments when you gave everything you had, when the smoke was thick and the ceiling groaned and you went back in anyway, those moments were real. They happened. And somewhere, because they did, someone made it home. That was always enough.